All right, everybody, welcome to an episode of Hive Live. Hive somewhat live, really. It's a bit of a cheap one. It's a pre-recorded webinar for everybody today, but I'm very pleased to have a wicked panel and for a very important topic around inclusion and belonging in the workplace. But before we jump into that, I would like to get the panel to introduce themselves. So Lucy, if we want to kick off with you.
Yeah, hi, I'm Lucy Craggs. I am the People and Culture Executive at Hive HR. I've been in this position since November last year, but I've been with the company around about 2 years. I'm fairly new to the HR world in terms of actually being in the job role itself. Very much baby HR, but sort of jumped in with Hive in building up our talent strategy and our ED&I. So I'm really excited to talk about inclusion and belonging in the workplace today.
Fantastic. Tracy?
Hi, everybody. My name's Tracy Alvin. I'm the People and Culture Director at Hive. I'm quite the veteran of HR. I've been in HR for 30 years and I've been with Hive nearly 1 year. So it's nearly coming up to an anniversary of me being here. So it's been an exciting journey and we've got an exciting 2022 ahead as well. So looking forward to working with all the team on our people strategy for this year.
And last but by no means least, Charlotte, if you want to introduce yourself, please.
Hi everyone, I'm Charlotte Axon. I'm the lead people scientist at Hive, definitely the best job title I've ever had. And essentially I work in partnership with organisations to help them access employee voice, understand what that's telling us and what to then do with it. Really interesting work that we do at Hive, and belonging and inclusion is a natural and key facet of employee engagement. So that's where a lot of my interest lies. Prior to working at Hive, I'd previously worked in areas around diversity inclusion and wider HR. So yeah, I'm really excited to be talking with the rest of the panel today about this really important issue.
Fantastic. And just for anyone who's wondering, I have nowhere near as impressive a set of credentials as the rest of the panel, but I'm Ben Lind and I am merely the host for this journey through information around inclusion and belonging. So I think the big question really to kick off with, and I'm happy just to sort of throw this out here to the floor for anyone who, is watching this and might be a little bit, unsure around, I guess, how really to articulate, inclusion and belonging. I mean, throw it out there. Really quick headlines. What is it and why is it important to organizations? Who's going to
start? Yeah. Well, I guess from my perspective, why it's important, I think it's important on a number of different levels. It brings a level of diversity within the organization, so different perspectives, different views and opinions on different topics. You get a really good blend of those different ideas. So it helps with innovation, it helps with your culture, it helps inform the culture. It really dovetails into kind of the performance of the organization as well, because if you've got that really inclusive behavioral and really inclusive culture, that really just breeds and breeds, and then it really creates a brilliant environment for all of our employees to work in. So I think the inclusion part really informs the diversity element of it as well, because I believe, if you are inclusive, then that naturally just drives the diversity element of it. So that's kind of my view. I guess over to you, Charlotte, in terms of your expertise and where you see it.
Yeah, so I think kind of fundamentally for me, there's the business side of it, and some of that you've already touched on, Tracy. So there's a lot of researching, evidencing the positive link between diverse and inclusive workplaces on metrics like performance. But on the human level, everyone wants to belong. People want to feel like they fall into a space where they've kind of found their people, and that can be an incredible, powerful thing. And sometimes when you're in a space and you feel like you belong, that's a really positive feeling. And definitely when you're in a space where you don't feel like you belong and you're not included, that's also a very powerful feeling. And some people will carry those feelings around with them as they move through work. So I think it's really important for us to understand, within our organisations and within other organisations, what impact that could be having on people. It's going to bring so many positives when you've got a workforce that feels kind of engaged and included and like they belong. And we really want to avoid those negative impacts where people feel like this is not for them and they feel excluded at work, it feels like a no-brainer for me, but obviously there's so much that sits around identity and people, because people are kind of complex beings. And I think what we'll probably talk about further in our discussion is the need to focus on people as individuals and everyone being different, and the power that can bring when we really harness the difference that people bring to their roles. Yeah, Lucy, keen to hear from you as well.
No, I think you've both hit exactly what I was going to say as well, is that importance for inclusion on, not only creating that culture of psychological safety, but making a workforce that is happy and feels comfortable in the place that they are. Things like making a conclusive environment is always going to be really beneficial in terms of recruitment and retaining your staff. You're matching up personal values with core values, and it brings it all together. And it's the difference between people looking for a job and looking for a career. And that's really something that we're focusing on our Hive. We want people to feel like it's somewhere that they can belong and they can really learn and grow in.
Yeah, we have a little saying where we have thrive and hive, and that really just kind of cements that whole idea of being inclusive and belonging to the organisation when we bring that together.
Can you be included without necessarily feeling like you belong? Are they very much one and the same, or do they sit as two sort of separate things in your opinion? Because if I go to, I can see some businesses kind of looking at this and thinking, well, yes, we're very inclusive. We've got some of this demographic, some of that demographic, maybe we've stacked our recruitment policy in such a way, but, maybe the mechanisms may not be in place to actually, work with, varying identities or demographics inside an organization. So do you think it's possible to have one without the other? Ooh, big
Waiting for somebody else to jump in there. I personally think that they do come hand in hand. Back to that thing about the values, I think if we have, we have our 4 company values, and they're very much based on making people feel very included, but also that's woven into them belonging with the company as well. So for example, one of the ones that I'll hold personally as well is respect for one another. I think that creates both the inclusion and the belonging, which they sort of intertwine. Personally, I don't think that there is one without the other. I don't think that it's something that can be exclusive, but more than happy to hear different opinions on that one.
I think personally, I don't think, I do think they're intertwined. I think, they run hand in hand, but I do also think it's sometimes that, there's a thought process there that if people have the policies and things in place, then the natural inclusion, people will feel that they belong. But unless they're really embedded in the organisation and they're really lived through the values, then that doesn't really happen and they don't really kind of join up. So I think the perception of that is that the connect is absolutely right. But in reality, I don't think it always happens. And I think that depends on how the organisation really lives and breathes, how they do those things.
It's a good point, that, Tracy. Charlotte, have you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, I was just going to completely agree with what both Lucy and Tracy have said, and that it's about kind of, I guess, the perception. If an organisation is claiming to be inclusive, but actually, people actually don't feel a sense of belonging, then you've missed the point a little bit. And so perhaps, when I reflect on the question that you've asked, Ben, that perhaps belonging is almost like a stronger measure of inclusion, where I don't feel as though you could have a sense of real belonging if you didn't feel included, but perhaps people feel inclusion within different parts of their kind of working identity, but whether they truly feel as though that they belong in this place and they've kind of found their people. Maybe it's kind of a stronger sense of inclusion. I don't know. You'll have to come back to us on that for a part 2, Ben.
Yeah, we're kicking off with the really big questions today. But cool. Well, I think that we've done a great job there, like early on, of articulating like what it is and why it matters, and maybe even identifying early on like a couple of the potential discrepancies or pitfalls around something like this, not being taken seriously enough, or maybe not being, implemented to its fullest potential, shall we say. But, let's dial up on the positives for a second. Let's talk about sort of what happens when we get it right, But, if you want to reverse engineer getting it right, you have to start it in the first place. And I think one of the things that probably, I think one of the kind of the big barriers to conversations around, inclusion and belonging and everything is that sort of hesitation or that fear around getting it wrong, right? And I think one of the important things to start with is, how have we demonstrated, or how could we talk to other organizations around kind of getting rid of that fear of getting it wrong? Is it a case of just making a start and not letting perfection be the enemy of progress?
Yeah, and I do think you have to start somewhere. There's always a journey, and there's always a beginning, and there's always a middle, and sometimes that, people always say there's an end. For me, there's never really an end. There's almost just an evolvement of that. So I think what the businesses have to do, and in particular, I think what we're looking at doing here, partnering with our own people science team, is starting that journey and looking at, who is Hive? What do we want? How do we want our culture to kind of shape and mold and, evolve as that goes on? So there's got to be a starting point. And I think people need to just forget about being perfect, because it doesn't exist. that my view anyway, it just doesn't exist. And there will always be somebody along that journey and along that road who will come along and, put a different perspective into it and make us think a little bit differently. And as long as we are open to that, then I think that really enriches that whole inclusion and feeling that they belong to that organisation, because that active listening is really, really important in this topic. And we have to go through the journey making sure that we actively listen to what people are telling us and how they want it to shape out as well. So no, perfection doesn't exist, and we find a starting point and just grow and develop and evolve it from there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think Tracy's bang on with that. I think the big thing to remember is that things like equality, diversity, inclusion, it's an ever-changing field. There is never going to be a sense of perfect, we're getting this all right. And as a bit of background, before I went into the role that I'm in now, I was in our customer success team, and there's been a huge growth in people doing these sort of equality and diversity surveys, and most of the time we had customers who would be coming to ourselves or the people science team and sort of getting us to double check, are we doing this right, are we asking the right questions? And it was that what you were talking about, Ben, that fear of getting it wrong that was stopping people from sort of jumping in full force and really pushing inclusivity in the workplace, because there is this fear of, if I say the wrong thing, if I do the wrong thing, if I implement, the wrong thing, am I going to marginalize one group? Am I going to upset some people? And that stops things from really getting off to a start. I know it's something that we've always said ourselves at Hive. We're not specialists. We aren't equality and diversity specialists. However, we are totally open at being completely transparent in what we're doing ourselves, letting our customers and anyone who's asking know what it is that we're implementing, we're doing to sort of drive inclusivity and belonging in the workplace, and to help and support in that way. We have our new thing, Hive Plus, which is amazing for sort of HR professionals to discuss a bit more what they're doing, and we use it to discuss what we're doing as well. And I think that network really helps with that. I think the more people talk about it, the more they open up about the pitfalls of the things that they're doing right and wrong, the more that's going to grow and get better.
Yeah, and you mentioned transparency there. I'm a little bit. I came up in I've been sort of around the startup culture for a little while, and I remember being, maybe in kind of the mid 2010s when radical transparency was this thing that first came around, and I've kind of seen both sides of it, right? Because I think that the meaning of it has almost evolved as people's understanding of inclusion and stuff like that. Because when I was in my kind of early 20s, I worked at a business that proclaimed radical transparency, and they just used that as I'm going to speak to you however I want to speak to you, and I'm just being radically candid here. So what does radical transparency mean to us as an organization, or what should it mean to organizations that don't just want to use it as like a blanket, I'm going to say I'm going to absolve myself of communicating without, thoughtlessly is probably a good way of saying that.
I mean, I think the transparency element of it is something that needs to be measured. And you think about what information is really pertinent to the organization, to the business, and what information do you maybe need to just kind of look at it and think about the positioning of that information. So I'm not a fan of kind of everything open there, and I actually think in some ways that damages, and it can be damaging and more limiting to kind of what we're talking about now, being inclusive and diverse, because sometimes then individuals can, forget about the values that you've got in place. So yeah, I think transparency, yes, measured in terms of the message and being consistent with that message in terms of that you want to get across.
And I think kind of fairness underpins a lot of this as well. So often, people are thinking, well, I expect that my leaders will role model the behaviours that they expect of me. So, it kind of doesn't matter where someone sits in the organisation. Everyone is just people at the end of the day. But kind of treat people how you like to be treated kind of approach has some relevance, I think, there. And in terms of transparency and honesty, I do think to create that sense of psychological safety, leaders need to kind of admit when things haven't gone well and make mistakes. We're all human, and I think employees appreciate that. I don't think it means that you share absolutely every element of everything, like Tracy said, because that is not always going to be productive. But it means, I think, sharing the important stuff and sharing the stuff that actually people want to hear. And if you're not sure what it is that people want to know, then ask them, and you'll probably find out that way. And I think I would approach this the same way that I approach a lot of topics that I work with customers on, which is, just because you're not asking it, just because you're not seeking to find it out, doesn't mean that it's not existing. In fact, all you do by avoiding issues and not being prepared to approach things head on is just, put stuff underground further. And I think you just have to be prepared to approach stuff and challenge stuff, ask the questions that you're almost afraid of getting the answers from. For me, that's a level of transparency and openness that I think is important when we're talking about inclusion and belonging, rather than, like you said, the kind of radical transparency where it's about sharing everything and anything with everyone.
Yeah, I can see that. And I think that, you've said there, Charlotte, if you don't know, ask. And I think part of it is, like Lucy alluded to there, is actually, I think a lot of organizations, they're not sure what to ask, right? So when you're talking about the importance of, kind of that executive team or SLT or whatever you want to call them, and kind of having that relationship, like I'm kind of throwing this out there as an assumption, like I imagine for us at Hive, kind of at the start of this journey and appreciating that, what's going to be right at one stage of the business's life cycle might not necessarily be as correct for the next stage of it. I imagine we're in a bit of a fortuitous position, having kind of in-house expertise, if you like, to kind of ask these questions and understand maybe the evolutions in this kind of space.
Yeah, and I think with any question that you ask people, you've got to think about what do I expect from a response? You've got to kind of put yourself back in that position and think, well, if I was asked this question, am I going to get the outcomes that I'm expecting? And by that, I don't mean let's phrase it in a way where we hear what we want to hear. I mean, are you asking the question in a way and through an avenue which is going to lead to the most productive insights? And yeah, that's what we're here to support organizations with, and hopefully what we can do internally within our own business. And yeah, that is kind of a skill, and I will always kind of play that back to the organizations that I'm working with and thinking, well, once we've put this question out here, we can't retract the question. What is it that you expect from these answers, and is there anything that you're afraid to ask? And I could challenge you and say, actually, maybe you should ask that, because to be honest, a lot of the time people will tell you it anyway. Sometimes people find ways of telling you things even if you haven't asked them, because they're just so frustrated.
I can see that. I can see that. Tracy, have you got anything to add there about maybe from that kind of executive perspective? Like, has there been, naming no names and not necessarily talking about Hive, of course, but, have you maybe seen firsthand kind of an example of that, like, we need to ask this, guys, like it's time just to get that question out there and see what we can do?
Yeah, absolutely. And there is sometimes a fear around asking some of those difficult questions. But, Charlotte's point is absolutely bang on. You have to ask them because you have to get under the skin of what really is going on in the organisation to look at anything that you need to do. So, sometimes it can be uncomfortable and sometimes you have to prepare yourself for what you're going to get back. But in that, it's for the greater good of the organisation and for the employee base going forward. So yeah, I don't know if that answers it at all, but yes, and unfortunately in my position, you're kind of that mediator where you're going, we really do need to ask this question, and then you've got maybe some of the other areas of the business where we'll go, well, no, we don't need to do it, but you have to then have a level of influence and kind of measures around why you want to do that and the rationale behind it to get to where you need to be.
Mm-hmm. Well, on that note, then let's take it into maybe more of the actual doing of it. Yeah. So Charlotte, I guess we'll throw to you for this first one. Like, what are some of the lookouts? Like, how are we seeing organizations doing this, would you say?
Yeah, so I think first and foremost, a lot of organisations are really wanting to tackle this, are being brave, are really wanting to approach this, are sensing that a lot happened last year and in 2020, which was the year before.
I've lost where we are with the years, to be honest.
The 25th month of 2020, isn't it? Feels like that.
Absolutely. But people have really recognised that this isn't something that they can make assumptions about or, leave on the back burner for much longer. And like we said, it kind of underpins a lot of, what we talk about when we talk about employee engagement anyway. So I have seen a lot of that. When I'm thinking of insights and trying to understand what those insights are telling us, there's quite a few things that I'm mindful of when I kind of put on my inclusion glasses, and one of those is thinking about when we look at the responses, who's not reflected in those responses. So kind of recognizing that there are different groups of people who are less likely to respond to surveys, and what is that telling us? Do we have the views of everyone who we need to take this forward and make informed decisions? And actually, naturally, we're going to have fewer responses from minority groups because minority means that there's less. And are we sure that we're actually capturing all of those views? And if we're not, how can we make sure that we are capturing those views? Because really, we should be centering minority voices when we're talking about issues around belonging and inclusion, because often those voices are really hard to reach and often aren't heard. So what I'm thinking about when I'm kind of interrogating that data is, whose voices am I hearing here? And number of voices isn't necessarily more important than the kind of the quality of that feedback that I'm getting back in and the representative nature of that feedback. So I think that's one thing. I'm also looking at when we ask certain questions, perhaps if we want to understand people's kind of demographic backgrounds, when we look at people who choose not to disclose that information, I find that really interesting because non-disclosure in itself is a finding. So, for example, what I've been finding recently is a lot of cases where if we've asked people to disclose that demographic data, when we look at people who have chosen to not provide that, and then we look at their experiences from the rest of the survey, we find that they're actually showing lower scores. So for me, what we're seeing is people who don't feel like they're able to express their true identity are having a less positive experience all around. So for me, that's quite interesting, and that's a little bit of a trend that I've been seeing recently. But I think the main thing that I'm interested in is looking at that data and saying, okay, when we look at this by different groups of people, what are we seeing? What patterns are we seeing here? And can we try and split that down even further and get a real kind of deep dive into what people's identities are telling us? So for example, what are perhaps our younger generation in the workforce telling us about what they expect from a reward package, what are parents with childcare responsibilities telling us about our flexible leave policies, and breaking that down even further. Now we know that people are more than just their identities, but I'm interested in those trends because that's going to tell us a different picture. And already you know, you see some significantly different results when you look at data. So for example, we know that women are more likely to respond to surveys, but typically women score higher on engagement levels in surveys. So already you start to see different patterns, and there's lots of kind of theories and research out there as to why that might be, but there's loads that we can do with that data. And what I really want to do is to be able to present that back to organizations and say, well, this is the story that we're seeing from the data, and this is unique to you as an organization. And so here's some of the things that you might want to consider. So yeah, there's a lot that kind of goes on in my mind when I'm looking at it from a data perspective. And obviously I'm trying to think about, for the likes of Lucy and Tracy, like, what is really helpful for you? What is it that you want me to tell you? And often people just want kind of the straightforward answer and the easy solution, and it often isn't, because there's no kind of silver bullet, and it is a long-term strategy. But like we've said before, you do have to kind of start from somewhere, don't you, to make progress.
Yeah.
If you don't mind, Charlotte, I've just got a couple of questions just off the back of what you were saying there. And I mean, I could pick your brains for days about this, but just to loop back to the start. So you're talking about the people who will prefer not to say, or prefer not to say in a survey. Would you say somebody, so say you're a Hive user yourself, hypothetically, not speaking about myself, would you say to look at that, you know, that demographic, look at prefer not to say as almost as a demographic in itself, take that aside and go, right, what is happening in this group? So I think it almost becomes natural. You see the prefer not to say, you sort of write that off and go, right, we'll focus on who we know in this. Would you say take that group there and really study that in itself as a separate entity?
Yeah, if you're able to, I'd say absolutely, because, you know, if we're to dismiss what we don't know, we're limiting our ability to know even more. And yeah, Tracy will probably.
Yeah, totally agree. And I think, you know, having ran a survey, and, you know, it's that insight, because that's the picked, or whatever the terminology is, I'm not articulating that right, but that is the kind of unknown, and it's the unknown we want to uncover, and we want to get to know, because it's only when we get to know those things that it really informs like what we do from a business and a strategy perspective. So if Charlotte was to present that data for me, I would be looking for those pockets of things where and I would be curious in terms of, well, why? What's happening here? What's not going right? What's not working? What's the environment saying? So I would be asking myself all of those questions around that data as well. And then I would be partnering with Charlotte, and I would be saying, right, okay, what's going to be our action? You know, we've got this insight. So what's the actionable outputs that we need to do from there? Where can we look at? And how does that really inform that strategy that I've got in my head about what I want from an ED&I perspective for Hive?
This might be a bit of a simplistic question, and apologies if it speaks to my naivete on the subject, but do we, when people do prefer not to say, do surveys ever ask people why they prefer not to say, or is that not something that's done? Because I can, and I'll qualify that question. So if I'm putting myself in the shoes of, you know, say I'm part of the executive team, and I'm, you know, getting, you know, gassed up to do a bit more work in inclusion and belonging, and we're looking to really take it seriously and look to uncover the data, and I am, you know, I'm putting this out to my workforce. You know, if I'm being totally honest here, like, I think I would be disappointed in those prefer not to says, because I would think, well, you're probably the people that we're most trying to reach, and in a way you're choosing not to contribute towards what I perceive as being the improvement of things for you. So is it a case, you know, have we ever seen, or could we ever see organizations wanting to kind of be a little bit more direct around that kind of prefer not to say criteria, or is it more a case that we need to just look to disseminate from the other trends and, you know, data inside the report why people might not want to say who they are, or how they identify, not who they are, sorry, how they identify?
Yeah, I mean, Charlotte, I don't know whether we'll differ in opinion here, but I think sometimes it can be a little, you know, when I get those and people have said prefer not to say, sometimes I go, oh, it's a bit of a sinking feeling, if I'm honest, because it's back to exactly that point you raised. I'm doing this to get the insight to help and inform, because I want to be an active listener. But it still says that there's something fundamentally wrong in the business when people still do not feel through an anonymous survey that they've got the psychological safety to be able to comment. And often, we'll try and we'll leave the comments open so people can put their comments and can put something in there if they want to say something about why they've chosen not to do it. But unless I asked a direct question, is if you tick this box, please tell me why, I don't know that I would get anything anyway, because they haven't had the safety in the first place to be able to put it in. So I don't know, Charlotte, if you've got a different opinion on that, but
yeah, no, I mean, I essentially agree that there's clearly something. If we're to make any assumption about that as a finding, I think a safe assumption to make is that people perhaps don't feel as though they can share that, and there will be lots of legitimate reasons for that risk of being identified through what you say, if that's going to be an experience that you'll feel is unique to you. Totally legitimate, and I would support anyone who doesn't feel as though they can't say that. And I think we have to think from an organizational perspective, again, thinking about fairness and it being a two-way process. If a person feels as though an organization is doing them a disservice by whatever it is that's created a level of distrust, for me the organization needs to work to build that trust back up with that individual. And only when the organization has created that environment is the person kind of within their rights to then choose to share that information, because you don't owe, I don't think you owe your organization feedback on demand. I think it's a two-way street where the culture of kind of safety, psychological safety, needs to be there, and then people have a commitment to provide that feedback, but only when they feel safe. And so I wouldn't be of the view that we interrogate those prefer not to says, but what I would say is that perhaps we think about different avenues and mechanisms for gathering that data. So you don't have to do everything via questions on a survey. You can think about other routes, other mechanisms for understanding people's feedback, whether you set up focus groups as a result of the survey and seek to really actively include those people's voices. I just think that people are perhaps kind of testing the organisation on how much they can trust what they're going to say, because once you put it out there, it can't be taken back. So I do think it is a level of judgment that people are making when they choose to respond in a survey. They're thinking, well, are you going to do anything useful with this information, or am I just going to pour my heart out again and never see anything back? Yeah. Is this going to be used against me? Is my manager going to see all of those questions? And I do think they are legitimate, albeit of course it's very disappointing when you don't get the insight that you're really looking for, as Tracy's mentioned.
Yeah. No, sorry, go on, Tracy. Were you going to say something?
No, I was just going to say, I completely agree with kind of what Charlotte said. So,
yeah, I can't agree enough either. I know what you're saying. It would be a sort of a catch-22 cycle if people prefer not to say, you're asking them why without implementing that psychological safety. You're going in a sort of loop, aren't you? But to touch on something you said there about not necessarily depending on surveying your staff as a means of getting that feedback and setting up focus groups, that's been something that we've done that's been incredibly positive at Hive. We set up a quality work stream maybe a year or so ago now, and even just within the work stream, how it's sort of grown and progressed in the way that people give feedback and how comfortable they feel given feedback is just amazing, and people are becoming more and more comfortable with every meeting that we have. If we're implementing changes, we usually put in one of these feedback sessions afterwards to really, hear from different people in the organization. And I think just having those regularly, and with them being a bit more in person and being regular, it does build up that comfort in people. Maybe it's not something that works well in every organization, but it's definitely something that's worked really well with Hive.
It's about building on the confidence from the survey, though. So once you've done a survey, and like you say, if you don't get the insight that you're looking for, the action that you need to start is as Charlotte says, it's looking at the different avenues. And as a result, many organisations will then do a deep dive into kind of the results. They're separated out and they do this, that and the other, and they set up those focus groups. Those people who have then, if you want to do the same survey 12-month on and then redo it and then relook at the results. That will be those things that you've done in that interim period will be an indication of how well you've done them based on the next results of the survey. So it's always about kind of just like retaking the temperature on that as well, and looking at have you built that level of trust somewhere throughout that year, which has now reduced that prefer not to say. And I think that's the key to kind of building on these and building that kind of culture within the organization as well.
Yeah, I think that's it. And you know, to be honest, that's a really good opportunity to kind of move into the next part of this discussion, which is, you know, how to take it forward. You know, we've started talking there about, you know, psychological safety being an enabler of this type of thing, and then looking to kind of incorporate that over a period of time leading up to, you know, the subsequent round of surveying, for example. And I mean, just to kind of not dwell on it too thoroughly, but, you know, just in terms of, you know, creating that psychological safety for people, we've sort of presented both sides of the coin, in the sense that until we create that psychological safety, more people won't come forward. And yet somehow we still have to understand how to create psychological safety for people who haven't come forward, and yet still tailor it to them in a way that would make them feel more comfortable about coming forward next time. So it's looking for that, you know, kind of all-encompassing approach, and yet using that to create a greater sense of specificity in a way. So, like, I guess, what are, you know, some really kind of, if you're going to look at, say, I always like, because I'm a simple person, so I always look at quick wins, right? If we're talking about some quick wins, somebody who was going to, you know, step away from this webinar and go, okay, here's something I could do to increase a sense of psychological safety. Like, what are a couple of like quite high level, maybe, and it could be that I'm looking at it too simplistically. I appreciate that. You guys might be going, this isn't a quick thing, Ben. This takes years of excruciating work. But, you know, how could we distill that, if you were like into, say, 30 to 45 seconds of speech?
I don't know whether you want me to kick off. I think the quick wins for me is just taking a step back and looking at the avenues you've got for individuals to share information with you, and look at how safe you feel those avenues are for them. So, you know, not wishing to kind of promote Hive, the platform, but we have that open door functionality in there. That is one avenue. Have you got focus groups? Is that another avenue? And I think before you take maybe that approach, is just look at what the data is telling you, and look at the data and let that inform you in terms of thinking about those different avenues you can set up, which are pretty quick to do. You're always going to have, you know, individuals within your organization who are passionate about different topics and different things, and draw on their passion, because when somebody has that level of passion, you will see that getting driven forward. So that would be some of the things that I would say take a look at first and foremost. Charlotte?
I was just going to say, off the back of what you're saying about making sure that things are actionable, I would say make sure that you're using your internal comms strategy as well in a way that really works for your business. So if you are setting out surveys, make sure you're following that up with, you know, this is our results, we're feeding that back into the organization. You know, we hear you, we're going to look into this, we're going to review it. Once that review has happened, you're internally sharing that as well. Make sure that you're telling your people that you are listening and that action is coming, even if it's not, you know, it isn't something that can be implemented quickly. It is something that's still at the forefront of your mind, so they don't feel that a survey is being run that maybe was completely unnecessary, or that their voice has been lost in.
Yeah.
And in addition to that, I would say that you know, creating that kind of honesty and openness, where I think you can take a lot from an organisation in terms of how things are dealt with when things don't go to plan. So what kind of culture do we have when, you know, things don't go as we thought they would? Do we open an honest and positive dialogue about that? And do we support that as leaders? And are we open about our own, you know, mistakes as leaders? And do we create a space where it's okay to make mistakes, or do we penalise that? And in my mind, you do the former. That's kind of a rhetorical question, but I think leading from the top on that will really kind of demonstrate to people, actually, this is an environment where whoever you are will support people through just kind of learning from mistakes and promoting that positive dialogue, checking in with people regularly, you know, not waiting for for a survey as a space for people to express their views. Actually, the relationships that people have with their immediate line managers are incredibly powerful and have a really big effect on people's levels of engagement and belonging. But like Tracy said, making sure you've got a diverse range of avenues in which people can share their feedback, but also making sure that dialogue is two-way. Often when we think about communication, we think about telling people stuff, but actually make sure that you've got both sides of the coin. Like Lucy said, once you've committed to doing something, make sure you update people, because people will actually be sitting and waiting to find out what's happened as a result of that information that they've shared. And if they don't hear anything, even if stuff is going on, make sure you tell people, otherwise people will assume that it was wasted and useless, and then they won't participate next time.
Fair enough.
I can't agree enough with that first point that you made about eliminating that blame culture from an organization. I mean, if we're talking about inclusion and belonging, I mean, you unlock so much potential in your people by, removing any of that aspect of blame and being so open and honest about the mistakes you're making. Yeah, that's a really important point there, Charlotte.
What are we seeing from customers, Charlotte, as it relates to this kind of thing? What would you say is kind of some of the key trends that we see?
Yeah, so like I said, I'm seeing more organisations really willing to dive deep into this area. And actually, once people have done that, what I'm finding is that often it's not as bad as people thought it was going to be. Actually, you're finding out, we did already know that. We did already sense that something was going on there. And I think for people, it's helping them join the dots between the theories that they perhaps had it in their minds, but were too scared to test. And now we've got the results, then our theory is supported. So I really like that, and I really appreciate that. Psychological safety is a key one. I get asked that question quite a lot. Well, how do I go about creating psychological safety? And it is an element of, well, it's not going to be a quick fix, because trust takes time to build up. But also there are some fundamental things that you can look at. And people really wanting to diversify their mechanisms for gathering employee voice. I'm seeing a lot more kind of organisations setting up focus groups and setting up groups of people who kind of champion and own engagement, which is great for us. That's the stuff that I like to see, where it doesn't just sit in the hands of an HR person amongst everything else that kind of gets lumped into someone in HR's role. So I'm seeing a lot of really positive things moving forward, and I think you see that in some of the responses as well. It's always really nice when you've asked people what more can we do, and sometimes people say you're doing a great job, and I always think it's really nice to share that positive feedback as well, that people don't just take part in surveys to have a moan and have a whinge. Actually, people value that opportunity to say thank you to their leaders for everything that they've done, and just express how well things are going. So that's kind of the positive side of things. Some of the watch outs that I'd say is, particularly when we're thinking about gathering the perspectives of minority voices, is that you're likely to get a contrast of opinion when you ask people the same question, and it can often be difficult to balance that. So on one hand, people may say, this is a really inclusive place, I've never seen or experienced discrimination, and then you might get two people who say something very different. And I think my perspective would be that you really need to focus on where you've heard that, because for me, if it exists somewhere, it can exist anywhere. So I think that's really important to understand that and take forward. But everyone's views are kind of equally valid. I think it's organisations wanting to understand how they balance those against each other, and what that means for them.
Right, excellent. And I totally I think that's a really valid point. Is like, just because one person's saying it doesn't mean that you only have to focus a tiny little bit on it. Like if anything, as you say there, Charlotte, like it's the fact that it's the outlier or the discrepancy that leads to it needing more what's the word? Examination. That's the one I was looking for. Not like me to not have some words like cool. Well, what about us then, from a Hive perspective, Lucy and Tracy, because it's nice for us to sit here and talk about what we're seeing from other people and what other people could or should be doing, but what have we done, and what are we continuing to look to do as it relates to stuff like this?
Yeah, so back to last year, we kind of put a stake in the ground, and we ran an ED&I survey internally. We have fed back on those results. I think the year 2020 is around the people strategy for me, and it is about the ED&I in a listening strategy. So I've partnered, obviously, using our own internal expertise with our people science team. So we're looking at what that journey looks like for us this year. So, we're going to work together, look at that insight that we had, and then actually just do that deep dive analysis in terms of what informs our listening strategy this year in terms of the surveys that we will do. We also last year reviewed our values. We started some work on our culture. We did the culture canvas with some of our teams, and that's really important for me to really drive that forward this year. There was some other kind of priorities that took a little bit of precedent, but people strategy for 2022 for Hive is absolutely about culture, which surrounds everything that we do, and those pockets of things. So we're looking at the frequency that we do the surveys. We're looking at how we use our open door. So we're also kind of just, deciding what we're going to do with that and how we're going to change that up. We've got our work streams in place. So we've got our own internal focus groups. In terms of the complete and employee value proposition, we're looking at all of the key touch points within that value proposition and looking at what we do, what our policies say, how are them informing this, our ED&I strategy and our listening strategy. And then we will kind of, evaluate them and evolve them going forward. There's a lot of work that we're doing, or we will be doing this year on unconscious bias, in recruitment, in performance discussions, and leadership discussions and development. So we're looking at all of that as well. So massive agenda for us in 2022 on this whole piece. So I guess it's a watch and see, but I'm very excited about it. I'm very passionate about it because, again, the people profession, we're the custodians of culture, but I don't actually own it, and I can influence it to a degree in terms of the initiatives that we do from a business perspective, but it's down to every individual.
Mm-hmm. Lucy?
I'm not sure there's much I could add to that. I think you did all of that absolutely perfectly there.
All right, fantastic. Well, I think, to be honest with you, I think we've covered most of it, and I think that's probably a good place to leave it for this particular topic anyway. So yeah, I'll thank you three very much for joining me for this and for adding your insights and your expertise. And thank you to everybody for watching. As always, for any further information, feel free to check any of us out. I imagine it's going to be one of these three, though. Check them out on LinkedIn, and keep an eye on the website as well for any further updates. So thank you all three of you very much for joining me.
Thank you very much.
Cool. And we'll see you guys next time. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.